Panzer II was designed as a stopgap vehicle until the Panther Ii and the IV were ready. These two tanks were going to be the primary arm of the mechanized panzer divisions, but their production was delayed, so the Panzer II was brought into frontline duties. It saw extensive action in the Spanish Civil War, and saw quite heavy use in the Second World War, despite the fact that its successors were introduced some years later. The Panzer III or IV were by and large ready a few years before World War II actually started, but the Panzer II wasn't phased out. It continued to see service late into the war. Basically any vehicles that were still in service were thrown out into the action. The Panther II was essentially an enlarged Panzer I. It was armed with a 2cm Kampfwagenkanon 30 and a light 7.92 MG34. This 2cm Kampfwagenkanon is based on an anti-aircraft gun. This was designed to increase the Panzer II's anti-armor performance, because the Panzer I only had a pair of light machine guns, therefore it couldn't engage armor. And while the 2cm was obviously an improvement, it wasn't satisfactory. If it did penetrate, it didn't do a great deal of damage because the shells were very small. And when it came up against tanks like the SAU-40 and B-1B in the Battle of France, it didn't have a chance of penetrating them, certainly not from the front, let alone penetrating a T-34 or a KV-1. And I pity the poor Panzer II crew that had to fight a T-34 or KV-1 in Barbarossa in Russia, because it did happen. There were hundreds of Panzer IIs involved in Barbarossa. Lots of them saw frontline duty because there were not very many Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. So my sympathies go to those Panzer II commanders. But it's powered by a 138 horsepower Maybach HLG2 TRM engine. And originally it was only armed with armoured with 14.5mm on the front, the same as the side armour. But the Spanish Civil War showed this was vastly inadequate. So the Ausführung-C, which is this version here, had extra armour bolted on to the hull and turret, an extra 15mm bolted on here, and the mantlet itself was replaced with a more protective layering. The 2C, by the way, is Germany's introductory reserve tier vehicle, battle rating 1.0. So that's how the 2C differs to earlier versions. It had thicker bolted on armour plates. Next is the Ausführung F, battle rating 1.3. This was the final production variant of the Panzer II. It had additional armour improvements. The hull was changed to a single one-piece 35mm plate, and the sides were increased to 20mm. The mantlet was also new. It was a single 30mm piece. The recasting of the hull into a single 35mm thick plate improved its rigidity compared to having multiple layers bolted together. It also had a newer 20mm cannon, the KWK-38, which had a faster rate of fire than the KWK-30. Next is the Panzerkampfwagen 38T, Tier 1, battle rating 1.7. The Panzer 38T was a Czechoslovakian tank, originally known as the LT-VZ-38. It was a Czech design built under German supervision. The T in brackets stands for Czechisch, which is German for Czech. The A, this vehicle here, was the first production model. It was an all-riveted construction, as you can see by the rivets all over the hull and the turret. And it was armed with a Skoda A7 37mm. It was powered by a Praga TNHPS 125 horsepower engine, and a 25mm thick hull front and turret mantlet. The sides and the rear were 15mm thick. Next is the 38T Ausf F. This is much the same, but it has additional armour plates welded on to improve protection. A 25mm plate was bolted onto the hull and the mantlet, bringing these two surfaces up to 50mm. An extra 15mm was also applied to the side and rear of the hull. So that's the two 38Ts. And a derivative of the Panther 38T was the Yak Panzer 38T, known informally as the Hetzer. This is based on the Panther 38T's chassis, but it has a new hull slope design. The front was very well protected, 60mm and heavily sloped. However, the side armour was far less impressive, as you can see here. Only 20mm thick and 8 on the rear. So a Hetzer commander had to be very careful to keep his front pointed towards the enemy, because the side offered very little protection, even though it was sloped. It wasn't enough to stop, well, really any guns, because the Hetzer was introduced in March 1944, so by that time virtually all anti-tank guns would have no problems penetrating that, even with the slope. It was armed with the Pak 39 L48, the same weapon the Panther IV mounted, but obviously, as you can see, it's compared to the Panther IV, a much smaller design. It could be more easily camouflaged and hidden and laid in ambush. The engine was improved over the 38T, a 158 horsepower Praga 6-cylinder. Despite being produced in relatively small numbers, only 1,800, the Hetzer proved to be a formidable weapon. Its small size and its impressive manoeuvrability allowed it to engage the enemy largely on its own terms. So the 38T lived on late into the final stages of the war as a successful tank destroyer. So that's the German light tanks that I haven't covered in previous videos, and one of their derivatives. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Reach for the Sky. See you soon.